Hello and welcome to the Canvas FastTrack. In this 2.5-minute video, we will discuss utilizing peer review for assignments and discussions at the modification level of technology integration. Students reviewing each other's work and leaving quality feedback directly on assessments is an amazing strategy that improves student communication skills and feedback. Simplifying and modifying what, when, where, and how students can give feedback and access feedback is key in Canvas. Any assignment can be set up as a peer review assessment. There are a few options that we have to point out because they're incredibly valuable. Anonymity. Teachers can select anonymity so that those reviewing each other don't know who reviewed them, and those reviewing don't know who they're reviewing. Note that as the teacher, you will always know who was the reviewer and who was the reviewee. We also like to share, in a typical writing class, we're used to pass the paragraph. We can now have students log in and spend some quality time giving feedback to each other. This can create a redefining task in stressing the importance of constructive feedback, giving improvement suggestions, rather than just saying, wow, that was great. You can also have students reflect and advise what they learned from each other in the peer review process, modeling that we're always learning, even when we think we know it all. In a future Fast Track, we will dive deeper into flipping peer review from an assessment to teaching with peer review. The discussion tool can also be utilized as a peer review in a couple of ways. Specifically, teachers can assign a peer review to students to check over each other's posts, possibly in the fashion of post once, reply twice type format. Another option is to open up the discussion in a more chat style, where students can post documents or other information, and then the whole collective class can give feedback to one another, building on what they all know. The ability for students to see if others have similar questions or if they ran into a similar problem or issue with the content is reassuring that they're not alone on an island. The last item with peer review we want to share is giving prompts for those younger learners. Start them young, and this will be a breeze by the time they get to high school and college. Sometimes quick statements or sentence starter templates help trigger a flood of ideas. With Canvas and the directions, posting those starters is a breeze and saves time for teachers to not have to repeat themselves. Students can choose what feedback works best for them. Thanks for watching. Please comment below with any suggestions or requests for future Fast Track videos.